Good evening and welcome to Adam's Scary Stories. Before we begin, a humble request. If you enjoy our channel, please consider subscribing. Your support is what motivates us to keep the stories coming. Really, it genuinely motivates us to keep searching for these chilling accounts to share with you. Your support means the world to us. Now, put in your earbuds, turn off the lights, and let's begin. It was 1 in the morning, the kind of deep, oppressive quiet you only get in the mountains when the world feels like it's holding its breath. I was pulling the graveyard shift as the night porter for a cluster of upscale cabins nestled deep in the Rockies, a place where city folk came to escape the noise and pretend to be rugged. My job was to guard that silence, but on that night the silence was about to be shattered by a terror that would freeze the very marrow in my bones. The office had an old VHS player my boss had installed to keep me from dozing off. Tonight I was watching a classic, John Carpenter's The Thing. On screen, a group of isolated men were succumbing to paranoia, unsure of the monster hiding among them. The tension of the film, mixed with the profound darkness outside, was creating a seriously creepy vibe. That's when I heard it, a sound from the wooden porch just outside the office. I immediately muted the TV. It wasn't the clean, sharp sound of a person walking. It was a heavy, dragging, erratic shuffle, the sound of a mortally wounded animal pulling itself along. My heart started hammering against my ribs. We got bears and mountain lions up here, but this sounded different. It sounded like human suffering. I slid open the desk drawer and my fingers found the cold, familiar steel of the old shotgun we kept on hand. It was meant more for wildlife than people, but tonight, I had a feeling the threat was something else entirely. Gun in hand, I rose slowly from my chair. The office door and windows were large panes of glass, showing nothing but an inky black void. I squinted, trying to pierce the darkness, but saw nothing. The shuffling sound had stopped right at the door. For a moment, there was absolute silence, so profound I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. Then a human silhouette slammed against the window. I jumped back, a scream catching in my throat. It was a man, on his knees, his face pressed against the glass. A grotesque mixture of blood and a reddish-brown substance was drooling from his mouth and chin, staining his shirt. His eyes were wide open but vacant, filled with nothing but agony, helplessness, and an unspeakable fear. He dragged a trembling hand across the glass, leaving a bloody smear, and then collapsed bonelessly to the ground. For a second I was paralyzed. The horror on the screen had just become terrifyingly real. My training kicked in and I fumbled for the phone, dialing 911. The operator's calm, detached voice pulled me back from the edge. 911, what's your emergency? There's a man here. He's hurt, maybe. He's bleeding from his mouth, I stammered, my voice shaking. Sir, stay calm. Can you tell me what happened to him? I wedged the phone between my shoulder and ear and with the shotgun still in my hand, cautiously opened the door. A blast of cold, damp air hit my face. The man was on the ground, groaning, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I knelt beside him. Hey man, what happened to you? He tried to open his eyes, his lips moving, but only an incomprehensible mumble came out. He can't talk, I told the operator. Ask him if he can tell you where he's staying, she instructed. I asked him again. This time he summoned every last ounce of his strength. 2 words escaped his dry, cracked lips. Number 9. As he said it, his eyes rolled back and his head lolled to the side. A cold dread washed over me. He wasn't talking about a drink. He was talking about Cabin 9. He's saying Cabin 9, I yelled into the phone. "Send an ambulance now. Something is very, very wrong here." The operator assured me help was on the way, but I couldn't wait. God only knew what fresh hell was unfolding in that cabin. I hung up, tossed the shotgun back in the drawer, and sprinted towards cabin 9. It was the last cabin in the row, bordering the dense, dark forest. The closer I got, the heavier my feet felt, an instinctual fear screaming at me to turn back. The cabin door was slightly ajar, no light spilling from within. The same bloody vomit stained the doorstep. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was a nightmare. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood, vomit, and a strange, sweet, burning odor. The dining table was a chaotic mess of half-eaten food and liquor bottles. 2 people, a man and a woman, were sprawled unconscious on the floor and the sofa, their faces a deathly shade of blue, their clothes soiled with the same filth. Then I saw the third person standing over the kitchen sink. His whole body was racked with violent tremors as he held onto the counter for support, repeatedly vomiting blood and foam. He heard me and turned. His eyes were wide with the terror of a man staring into the abyss. "Please help me," he whispered, his legs giving out. I lunged forward and caught him before he hit the floor. "What happened to you guys?" I shouted, but he could only point a trembling finger towards the table. Lying there among the plates and bottles was an old leather-bound book. I knew then this was no simple crime. This was something darker, something profane. I gently laid the man on the floor and ran back to my office, my mind screaming for more help. By the time I got there, the wail of sirens was echoing through the valley. I called 911 again, telling them I had multiple victims, that the situation was critical. Soon, 3 ambulances and a police cruiser screeched to a halt. Paramedics swarmed towards cabin 9 while I gave my statement to a grim-faced officer. My boss, Mr. Harris, a tough-as-nails ex-military guy, arrived soon after. Even he went pale when he saw the scene inside. The paramedics loaded all 4 onto stretchers. They were in bad shape. One by one, the ambulances sped off, their lights cutting through the darkness. When the last one was gone, it was just me, Harris, and 2 cops. "It smells like death and filth in there," Harris said, his voice trembling slightly. "What the hell happened?" The police investigation soon uncovered a story more twisted than any horror movie. The cabin had been rented by 4 college friends for a reunion: Sarah, Mark, Jenny, and Alex. But one of them, Alex, had orchestrated the gathering for a sinister purpose. Alex had long been obsessed with the occult and satanic rituals. He had acquired an ancient grimoire that detailed how to summon an ancient demonic entity and bargain for power. According to the book, if he sacrificed the souls of 3 people close to him on a specific night, in a place of natural power, he would be granted immense knowledge and strength. This reunion was his ritual. He hadn't used poison. He had mixed a rare paralytic herb into the food, a substance that would incapacitate the body but leave the mind awake and aware. His plan was to perform the ritual as his friends lay trapped in their own bodies, their terror feeding the entity. The police later found strange, bloody symbols painted on the floorboards under the rug. But the plan went wrong. The herb had a weaker effect on Mark, the man who had stumbled to my office. He had managed to fight through the paralysis and escape to get help. Alex, lost in the fervor of his ritual, had tried to stop him, but Mark had vanished into the woods. When the police interrogated Alex, he just laughed. "You're too late," he kept saying, a manic gleam in his eyes. The ritual wasn't completed, but it was enough. He's awake. He's watching us now. The most disturbing part, however, was what happened to Mark. As the paramedics were loading him onto the stretcher, he suddenly regained consciousness. His eyes snapped open, but they were no longer human. He began smearing the blood from his own vomit all over his bare chest and face, screaming in a deep, guttural voice that didn't belong to him. He was chanting a name that sounded like no human language, each syllable dripping with ancient malice. "He touched me, I am his," he shrieked, his voice echoing across the valley. "Accept the offering." The same crazed, ecstatic light I'd seen in Alex's eyes was now burning in his. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the carnage in Cabin 9, heard Alex's insane laughter, and felt the chilling echo of Mark's unholy screams. I quit my job. I couldn't stand the silence of the mountains anymore. It no longer felt peaceful, but pregnant with a waiting, ancient evil. Sarah and Jenny survived physically, but the trauma left them shattered. Alex was sentenced to life in a maximum security prison, where he reportedly spends his days carving symbols into the walls of his cell and whispering to something no one else can see. And Mark? He was committed to a psychiatric hospital. For months, he continued his terrifying behavior, painting the walls of his padded room with his own blood and chanting that demonic name. Then slowly, he began to change. The doctors and psychologists who studied his case released their final report. Their conclusion: shared psychotic disorder. They claimed Alex, the primary psychotic, had imposed his elaborate satanic delusions onto his friends, particularly Mark. The combination of the hallucinogenic herb, the terror of the situation, and Alex's dominant personality had triggered an acute, temporary psychotic break in Mark. The report stated there was no evidence of demonic possession or a supernatural event. It was all a horrific, tragic game of the human mind. Mark is cured now. He has no memory of that night. For him, those hours of his life are a complete blank. But I don't buy it, I can't. What I saw in Mark's eyes that night wasn't just a mental illness. It was an ancient, nameless terror. The doctors gave it a label, a neat scientific box to put it in. But I know some things don't fit in boxes. I know something woke up in Cabin 9 that night. And no matter what the world calls it, I'll always wonder. Was Alex's call truly answered? And is Mark really cured, or is something just lying dormant, waiting silently inside him? My father and I were never close. When my parents went through a bitter divorce in the late 70s, he moved up to Crescent City and pretty much vanished from my life. He didn't fight for custody, didn't call much. It was like a switch flipped, and the man who taught me to ride a bike was suddenly just a stranger who shared my last name. The last time we spoke was on my 26th birthday. He was drunk, rambling about how his life had taken a horrible turn right around the time he left. He apologized for being distant, saying, "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, even if it means sacrificing everything." I dismissed it as drunken sentimentality. 7 months later, he was dead, a heart attack while swimming in his backyard pool. The inheritance was a shock. After the funeral, my brother and I learned that the successful man we thought we knew had died with almost nothing. A car, a house, a few thousand in savings, and one other thing, a piece of property near Black Marble Mountain. A one-room log cabin he'd built shortly after the divorce. Not even my mother, who kept surprisingly detailed tabs on him, knew it existed. My mom wanted to sell it sight unseen. "It's probably just a shack filled with empty whiskey bottles," she said with a dismissive wave. But I couldn't let it go. It was the one piece of his life that was a complete mystery, a loose thread in the frayed tapestry of our relationship. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to understand what he was doing out there, alone in the wilderness. Getting to the cabin was an ordeal. It was located in Siskiyou County, miles from the nearest town. Happy Camp. There were no roads leading to it. Accessing it meant a grueling 5-mile hike through unfamiliar, rugged terrain. I spent months planning, buying gear, and studying a map the attorney had procured for me. By the time I was ready to go in mid-November, a knot of apprehension had tightened in my stomach. I wasn't scared of the woods, I was scared of what I might find. I pictured evidence of a sad, lonely alcoholic, or worse, something degenerate and shameful. I wanted answers, but I never stopped to consider that some questions are better left unanswered. After a long drive, I left my car at a whitewater rafting outpost near a place called Cottage Grove, as a friendly local in Happy Camp had suggested. The hike was brutal. The trail was overgrown and I got lost twice, burning through my water supply far too quickly. The chlorine tablets I used to purify stream water made it taste like a swimming pool. Finally, after hours of sweating and cursing, the dense trees began to thin and I saw it, the cabin sitting in a small, lonely clearing. It was not the luxury man cave I had half expected. It was a crude, moss-eaten shack. The front wall was covered in deep scratches, as if generations of deer had used it as a rubbing post. A single small window stared out like a vacant eye, its glass long gone. The whole structure looked like it was one heavy snowfall away from collapsing. I tried the door, expecting it to fall off its hinges. Instead, it was surprisingly solid, thick and heavy. When I pushed it open, I saw why. The other side was crudely reinforced with thick metal panels bolted directly into the wood. It was less a door and more a barricade, but that detail was quickly forgotten as I stepped inside and my jaw dropped. The interior was a chaotic shrine to an obsession. Nearly every inch of wall space was covered with topographical maps of the surrounding area, all of them heavily annotated in my father's spidery handwriting. Dotted among the maps were photographs, dozens of them, all of the same man. He had curly red hair and in the older photos a bright, healthy smile. He was pictured with family, with friends, posing by a river. He looked happy, but other photos, some of which looked like candid shots taken from a distance, chronicled a disturbing deterioration. The man grew gaunt, his eyes hollowed out, his expression increasingly wild. There was one blurry picture of him shirtless and barefoot walking through the trees. Another showed him staring into a stream, his once short hair now long and matted. It was clear my father had been tracking him. The maps were covered with dates, times, and cryptic notes. "He's still here," one annotation read over a specific grid square. "Human scat feeding?" another questioned. My father wasn't just looking for this man, he was studying him like a wild animal, but why? I searched the cabin for more clues. In a desk drawer, I found a heavy .44 revolver and a box of ammunition. Next to it were several empty bottles of bourbon, just as my mom had predicted. There was no running water, no bathroom, just a canvas cot in the corner where my father had clearly spent many nights. As the sun began to set, I lit an electric lantern and studied the maps more closely. The notes became more unsettling. "Almost saw me, too close," was scrawled in thick, angry letters. Another read, "Made contact today." That gave me a flicker of hope, but it was followed by another entry. "Secondary contact. Bad reaction." The gun, the reinforced door, the obsessive notes, it all painted a terrifying picture. The red-haired man wasn't just a subject of my father's curiosity. He was a threat. And now I was in the heart of his territory, in the very place my father had built to observe him. The thought of hiking back in the dark was just as terrifying as staying. So I bolted the heavy door, closed the small wooden shutter over the glassless window, and tried to get some sleep on the cot. Exhaustion from the hike eventually won out and I drifted off. The sound of the wind in the trees, a low, incessant drone. I was jolted awake around 2:30 a.m. by a noise outside. My heart hammered against my chest. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear drawn by the scent of my food. But as I listened, the sound resolved into a steady bipedal shuffle. It was too confident, too rhythmic to be an animal. It was a person. My first move was for the gun. I wasn't a firearms expert, but I knew how to load it. My hands trembled as I slid the heavy cartridges into the cylinder. An animal might be scared off by a warning shot. A person out here in the dead of night was a different matter entirely. I crept to the small, shuttered window, slid it open a crack and peered out. The shuffling was getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. I swept the light across the tree line to my right. And then, he shuffled into view. He was completely naked. His pale skin was visible only in patches through a thick covering of dirt and grime. His long red hair was a knotted wild mane, and a similarly unkempt beard covered the lower half of his face. It was him, the man from the photographs. He didn't react to the flashlight beam. He just kept walking, circling the cabin as if inspecting it. He moved with a strange, swaying gait, his head lolling slightly from side to side. For a full minute, he circled, and all I could do was watch, frozen in stunned silence. Then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, a grotesque statue in the moonlight. My voice, when I finally found it, was a reedy croak. "Hey, I'm warning you, I have a gun in here!" He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there, swaying gently. Then, with a speed that defied his emaciated frame, he sprinted directly at the cabin door. The sudden explosion of movement sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I slammed the shutter closed and scrambled back, pointing the revolver at the door. The metal plates, the reinforced hinges, it all made a horrible kind of sense now. This had happened before. I braced for the impact, expecting him to throw his full weight against the door. But just as his footsteps reached it, they stopped. Silence. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of my heart. "I have a gun!" I yelled again, my voice cracking. "Breaking in here will be the last thing you ever do." No response, just dead, unnerving silence. Then a soft, gentle knocking began on the door. Tap, tap, tap. It was quiet at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, harder, more rhythmic with each repetition. I thought he was using his fist, but the sound of the impact was too broad, too dull, and it was at head height. The horrifying realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't banging his fist. He was smashing his head against the thick wooden door over and over and over again. "Stop it!" I screamed, staring at the vibrating metal plates. "Jesus Christ, stop!" In a desperate, terrified torrent of words, I started yelling at him, telling him I wasn't my father. "He's gone. He's dead. I'm not him." I must have sounded insane, but I didn't care. I just needed him to understand. The moment I said my father was dead, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then a voice from outside croaked my father's name. It was a dry, raspy sound, like a throat that hadn't been used for speech in a long, long time. But the name was clear. "He's dead," I repeated, my voice shaking. "He passed away. I'm leaving in the morning. I'll never come back." His only response was to croak my father's name again, this time a little louder, more insistent. I screamed at him then, a raw, primal yell of fear and frustration. "He's dead! I don't know what the hell you two are doing out here, but it's over. I don't want any trouble." I expected him to repeat the name again, but there was only silence. A long, drawn-out moment stretched into an eternity. Then I heard footsteps, gradually growing quieter as he walked away, disappearing back into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably, the heavy revolver feeling useless in my hands. Sleep was impossible. There was no way I was staying in that cabin until sunrise. I packed my things in a frenzy, my hands clumsy with adrenaline. On my way out, the beam of my flashlight caught the outside of the door. It was smeared with a mixture of saliva and blood. The hike back in the dark was the most terrifying experience of my life. Every shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam became the naked, red-haired man. Every hoot of an owl, every rustle of leaves was him, stalking me through the trees. I honestly thought I was going to have to kill a man that night. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my car, speeding away from those mountains. I drove straight home, wired on adrenaline, not sleeping for more than 24 hours. The next day, I called the ranger station and reported what I had seen, carefully editing the story. I said I'd found a man who seemed dangerously unstable, that I was concerned for his well-being. I mentioned my late father might have been trying to find a missing person, but I left out the obsessive tracking, the reinforced cabin, and the head-banging. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. The ranger's response chilled me to the bone. He told me I wasn't the first person to report a red-headed wild man in that area. The reports went back 15 years. Coincidentally, right around the time my parents got divorced. He said the man had never hurt anyone, just scared them. I asked if my father's name was on any of the reports. The ranger said no. For a moment, I felt the same pull that must have consumed my father. The curiosity, the need to understand the mystery of this man and his connection to my dad. I could keep the cabin, go back, piece together the puzzle. But then I saw the path it led down. A rabbit hole of obsession, of lonely nights in a remote cabin, of emptying liquor bottles until my own heart gave out long before its time. I put the cabin on the market the next week. I sold the land and the dilapidated structure as a single parcel at a steep discount. I just wanted it gone. I didn't want to be responsible for what might happen to the next person who ventured out there, drawn in by the same dark mystery. I had my answer. My father hadn't been a deadbeat. He had been a man haunted, a man who sacrificed his family and ultimately his life to stand guard over a darkness he couldn't contain and couldn't bring himself to walk away from. I chose to walk away. The ad called it the Huntsman's Respite. It was a rustic cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, available for rent during the off-season. The owner was a man named Silas Thorne, a semi-legendary figure in hunting circles. He was known for his almost supernatural ability to track and take down the most elusive game. He was also a notorious recluse. The idea of staying in his personal lodge, surrounded by the trophies of a master, was too good for my friends and me to pass up. There were 4 of us, me, Liam, my brother Ben, and our 2 college buddies, Jake and Chris. We were amateur hunters at best, but we loved the ritual of it, the escape from city life, the camaraderie, the crisp mountain air. We booked the cabin for a long weekend in late October, right as the aspens were turning a brilliant, fiery gold. The drive itself was an omen. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a deeply rutted dirt track that scraped the undercarriage of Ben's SUV. By the time we arrived, dusk was settling, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The cabin was larger than we expected, a 2-story log structure that looked like it had been hewn from the forest itself. It was imposing, almost fortress-like. The inside was exactly as we'd imagined, only more intense. It was a museum of death. Every wall was a testament to Silas Thorne's prowess. A massive grizzly bear, frozen mid-roar, dominated one wall. The heads of elk, moose, and bighorn sheep stared down with glassy, lifeless eyes. There were wolf pelts draped over chairs and a full-bodied mountain lion perched on a fake rock ledge above the stone fireplace. The air was thick with the faint, musky scent of taxidermy chemicals and old wood. "This is insane," Chris whispered, running a hand over the grizzly's coarse fur. "The guy's a living legend." "More like a living ghost," Jake added, pointing to a framed yellowed newspaper clipping on the mantelpiece. The headline read, "Local hunter vanishes after record kill." The article, dated 5 years prior, detailed how Silas Thorne had bagged a record-breaking bull elk and then seemingly disappeared. The authorities had searched for months, but he was never found. He was presumed dead, another victim of the unforgiving wilderness he so loved. "So who are we renting from?" Ben asked, a slight tremor in his voice. "Probably his estate," I reasoned. "Some lawyer in a city office just collecting checks." It was the only logical explanation, and we clung to it. The first night was filled with whiskey, poker, and exaggerated stories of our own meager hunting exploits. The dead eyes of the animals seemed to follow us around the room, their silent judgment hanging in the air. It was creepy, but in a cool, atmospheric way. We were living in a horror movie set, and we were loving it. The next day we went hunting. The forest was beautiful and eerily quiet. We saw tracks, but no actual game. It felt as if every living creature was hiding from something. We returned to the cabin empty-handed as the sun began to set, our spirits slightly dampened. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The cool, creepy vibe was replaced by a genuine sense of unease. A storm had rolled in, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like a trapped animal. The power flickered and died, plunging us into a thick, suffocating darkness broken only by our flashlights. "Well, this just got a whole lot spookier," Jake said, trying to sound casual. We were gathered around the fireplace, trying to get a fire going with damp wood. That's when Chris noticed it. Tucked away behind a large bearskin rug tacked to the wall was a section of the floor that didn't quite match. The wood planks were newer, the seams tighter. Curiosity piqued. We pulled the heavy rug aside. There, almost perfectly camouflaged, was a trap door with a recessed iron ring. "No way," Ben breathed, his flashlight beam trembling. "A secret basement." A debate erupted. I was against opening it. It felt wrong, like a violation. This was someone else's home, even if he was dead. But Jake and Chris were practically giddy with excitement. "Come on, Liam, this is the best part of the horror movie. We have to see what's down there. Maybe it's his secret stash of vintage whiskey." Their enthusiasm was infectious, and my own curiosity betrayed my better judgment. Together we heaved the heavy door open. A wave of cold, musty air washed over us, carrying a strange, metallic, coppery smell. It was the smell of old blood. Jake, ever the brave one, went first, his flashlight beam cutting into the darkness below. A steep, narrow wooden staircase led down into a small, stone-walled cellar. We followed, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement was not for storing wine. It was another museum. But the trophies here were not from animals. Hanging from hooks on the far wall were clothes, a faded red hiking jacket, a pair of worn-out boots, a brightly colored backpack, its side pocket still holding a water bottle. On a series of rough wooden shelves were personal effects, laid out like archaeological finds. A wallet containing a driver's license for a young woman from Oregon. A digital camera, a set of car keys, a small leather-bound journal. My blood ran cold. I recognized the jacket. I'd seen it on a missing person poster at a gas station on our way up. A hiker named Sarah Jenkins who had vanished in these very mountains 2 years ago. "Guys," I said, my voice barely a whisper. These are from the missing hikers." The realization hit us all at once, a physical blow that stole the air from our lungs. We weren't in a hunter's lodge. We were in a serial killer's trophy room. Silas Thorne hadn't been a victim of the wilderness. He was the wilderness. He was the monster that stalked these woods. Panic set in, a frantic, animalistic terror. We had to get out. Now. We scrambled back up the stairs, our hands shaking, our minds reeling. "He's dead, right?" Chris stammered, his face pale as a ghost. "The newspaper said he disappeared 5 years ago." Then who put Sarah Jenkins' jacket down there? She only went missing 2 years ago. Ben shot back, his voice cracking with fear. The horrifying truth dawned on us. He wasn't dead. He was still out there, and this was his home, his hunting ground, and he could be back at any moment. We grabbed our jackets and car keys in a frenzy, not bothering with the rest of our gear. We just had to get to the car and drive. As we burst out of the cabin door, a new horror stopped us dead in our tracks. Ben's SUV was gone. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping open in wide, mocking grins. The engine had been tampered with, its wires cut and dangling like severed nerves. We were stranded, trapped. "He knows we're here," Jake whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "He's been watching us." The quiet forest no longer felt beautiful. It felt menacing, alive, its shadows filled with a predatory intelligence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig was him, circling us, playing with us the way a cat plays with a mouse before the final killing bite. We retreated back into the cabin, the only shelter we had, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a tomb. We barricaded the door with a heavy oak table and armed ourselves with our hunting rifles, our hands slick with sweat. We were the hunted now. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. We sat in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside, jumping at every sound. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We were 4 city boys with guns trapped in the lair of a master predator, a human monster who knew this terrain better than we knew our own backyards. Around 3 a.m., the storm began to subside. The wind died down, replaced by a silence that was even more terrifying. Then we heard it, a slow, deliberate footstep on the front porch. Then another. We all raised our rifles, pointing them at the door, our hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against our ribs. A shadow fell across the window, a large, broad-shouldered silhouette. He was here. There was a soft metallic scraping sound like a key sliding into a lock. But he didn't open the door. Instead, a low, gravelly voice, a voice that sounded like it was dredged up from the earth itself, spoke from the other side. "I see you found my private collection," he said. The voice was calm, almost amused. "I do so hate it when guests go snooping." A primal scream tore from Chris's throat. He raised his rifle and fired blindly through the door. The blast was deafening in the confined space. Wood splintered, then silence. "That," the voice said, still unnervingly calm, "was a mistake." We heard a heavy thud against the back of the cabin, then the sound of shattering glass. He was coming in through a window. We scrambled, trying to get a clear line of sight, but the cabin was a maze of shadows and taxidermied beasts. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my finger on the trigger. A massive figure emerged from the darkness. It was Silas Thorne. He was older than in the newspaper photos, his face a mask of hard lines and cold fury, but it was him. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a large, wicked-looking hunting knife. Before I could react, he lunged not at me, but at Jake. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was inhuman. Jake fired, but the shot went wide. The knife plunged deep into Jake's chest. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. Ben screamed and fired, the bullet catching Thorne in the shoulder. The big man grunted in pain but didn't slow down. He ripped the knife free and turned on Ben. I fired and my shot hit him in the leg. He stumbled, roaring in pain and rage. Chris, paralyzed by fear, was fumbling to reload his rifle. Thorne ignored me and charged at him. He was a wounded animal, a cornered bear, and he was going to take us all down with him. Seeing my brother about to be slaughtered, I did the only thing I could. I dropped my rifle and charged, tackling Thorne from the side. We crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs. The man was impossibly strong, his hands like iron vices. His cold, dead eyes stared into mine, and in them I saw nothing but a chilling, predatory emptiness. His knife was still in his hand, and he was trying to bring it around to gut me. Suddenly a shot rang out, deafeningly close. Thorne's body went rigid. The light in his eyes flickered and died. He slumped on top of me, his dead weight crushing the air from my lungs. Ben stood over us, his rifle smoking, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. We had survived. But the nightmare was far from over. We were miles from civilization with no vehicle, and one of our friends was dead. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, waiting for the sun, the dead body of Silas Thorne lying in a pool of blood on the floor, his glassy eyes staring up at the ceiling, just like the trophies on his walls. When dawn finally broke, we took Thorne's keys and found his old, beat-up truck hidden in a shed behind the cabin. The drive back to town was silent, the three of us lost in our own private hell. We told the police everything. They found the basement, the bodies of other missing hikers buried in shallow graves in the woods, and confirmed that the monster of the Bitterroot Mountains was finally dead. They called us heroes, survivors. But they don't see us at night when we close our eyes and see the dead, glassy stare of the animals on the wall. They don't hear the silence of the forest or the sound of a slow, deliberate footstep on a wooden porch. We escaped the Hunter's Museum, but in a way, we never really left. We just became part of the collection. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I'm a wildlife photographer. Or at least I was. For me, the thrill was always in the chase, the patience, the moment when the natural world rewards you with a glimpse of something truly wild. My specialty was elusive predators. Wolves, mountain lions, bears. To capture them, you have to go where they live, far from any sign of human civilization. That's what brought me to a remote cabin in the heart of Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest. The cabin was a rental, a tiny one-room shack owned by the Forest Service, available only to researchers and photographers with special permits. It was primitive, no electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove and a cot. It was perfect. My goal was to capture a shot of the legendary ghost cat, a pale, almost white mountain lion that had been spotted in the area but never properly photographed. For a photographer like me, getting that shot would be the equivalent of finding the Holy Grail. I spent the first day scouting locations, looking for tracks, setting up my gear. I had 6 high-end trail cameras, motion-activated and equipped with infrared night vision. I placed them strategically along game trails near a stream and in a clearing I suspected the ghost cat might use as a hunting ground. I set one camera facing the cabin itself, a habit I'd developed to capture any curious critters that might approach my temporary home. By nightfall, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I cooked a simple meal on my camp stove, watched the stars ignite in the pristine, ink-black sky, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke with the sun, a giddy excitement bubbling in my chest. I made a quick cup of coffee and then eagerly set out to retrieve the memory cards from my cameras. It was like Christmas morning for a wildlife photographer. Back in the cabin, I plugged the first memory card into my laptop. The camera had been placed by the stream. The first few dozen images were of nothing, a branch swaying in the wind, a raccoon scurrying past. Then a magnificent buck appeared, its antlers like a crown drinking from the stream. A beautiful shot. I scrolled further. More raccoons, a curious doe, and then something else. It was a single frame, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m. The image was blurry, distorted, as if the subject had moved too quickly for the shutter. It was tall and impossibly thin, a vertical smudge of gray against the dark backdrop of the forest. It didn't look like any animal I had ever seen. I squinted, trying to make out its form. It looked vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its proportions all wrong. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera, maybe a deer moving at an odd angle. I moved on to the next card from the camera in the clearing. This one had captured a pack of coyotes, their eyes glowing like embers in the infrared light. And then, at 2:23 a.m., just 6 minutes after the first strange image, there it was again. This time it was closer to the camera, slightly more in focus. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a pine tree. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and unnaturally slender. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes, just a smooth, pale surface. Its long, spindly arms hung down to its knees. It was just standing there, perfectly still, as if observing the clearing. A cold knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I quickly went through the other cards. The cameras deeper in the woods had captured nothing but the usual nocturnal wildlife. My anxiety began to subside. It had to be a strange shadow, a technical malfunction. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. Then I got to the last card, the one from the camera pointed at my cabin. The first images were of me, returning to the cabin the previous evening. I scrolled through the timeline. A fox sniffed around the porch. An owl landed on the roof. Then at 2:48 a.m., my blood ran cold. It was standing right in front of the cabin, not 20 feet from where I was sleeping. The infrared light illuminated it in stark, ghostly detail. It was facing the cabin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening. The smooth, featureless face was directed right at my window. It was the same tall, slender figure. There was no mistaking it now. This was not a glitch. This was real. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My heart hammered against my ribs. Something had been outside my cabin in the middle of the night watching me. I kept scrolling, my hand trembling. The next photo, taken a minute later, showed it had moved closer, its long, spider-like fingers resting on the windowsill, peering inside. The image was taken from a low angle, and the figure loomed over the camera, a terrifying, elongated silhouette against the night sky. I felt a primal fear, the kind I'd only ever seen in the eyes of cornered animals. I was trapped, isolated miles from any help. And something was hunting me. I scrolled to the next image. My breath caught in my throat. The timestamp was 3:05 a.m. The photo was taken from inside the cabin. It took me a moment to understand. The camera was outside. How could it take a picture from inside? Then I realized it wasn't from my trail cam. It was from my personal camera, the one sitting on the small table next to my cot. I never set it to be motion activated. I never even turned it on. The image was grainy, taken in the low light filtering through the window. It showed me asleep on the cot, a vulnerable, oblivious figure. And standing over me right next to my bed was the creature. It was bent over, its featureless face just inches from mine, as if studying me, examining me like a curious insect. Its long, thin arm was outstretched, its fingers almost touching my cheek. A scream, raw and guttural, tore from my throat. I threw the laptop off the table, scrambling back until my back hit the rough log wall of the cabin. It had been in here with me. While I slept, it had stood over me, watched me, almost touched me. Panic gave way to a desperate survivalist instinct. I had to get out. I didn't care about the ghost cat, about my gear, about anything. I grabbed my satellite phone, my car keys, and my largest hunting knife. I burst out of the cabin door and didn't look back. I ran, fueled by pure terror, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. The 2-mile hike back to my truck, which had seemed so pleasant the day before, was now a gauntlet of fear. Every shadow was the creature, every snapped twig was its footstep behind me. I reached my truck, my hands shaking so violently it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound a beautiful, reassuring promise of escape. I slammed the truck into gear and sped down the dirt track, not slowing down until the tires hit paved road. I drove for 2 hours, not stopping until I reached the first brightly lit, populated town I could find. I checked into a cheap motel, locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and sat on the bed shaking until the sun came up. In the harsh light of morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Had I been sleepwalking? Had I set up my own camera and photographed myself? It was possible. The isolation, the stress. Maybe I had suffered some kind of psychotic break. It was a more comforting thought than the alternative. But I couldn't explain the trail cam photos, I couldn't explain the figure at the window, and I couldn't explain the deep, visceral certainty I felt that I had not been alone in that cabin. I reported the incident to the Forest Service, carefully omitting the more unbelievable details. I told them I thought I had a stalker, a trespasser. I mentioned the strange photos. They were dismissive, attributing it to local pranksters or my own overactive imagination. "It gets lonely out there," the ranger said with a condescending smile. "The mind plays tricks." I never went back for my equipment. The thought of returning to that place, to that suffocating silence, was unbearable. I tried to go back to my life, to my work, but the passion was gone. The thrill of the chase had been replaced by a gnawing, constant fear. I couldn't look at a dark forest without seeing that tall, slender figure in my mind's eye. I couldn't sleep in a dark room without feeling the ghost of its presence standing over me. A few months later, I received a package in the mail. It was a large, padded envelope with no return address. Inside were the memory cards from my trail cameras, and one extra card. My heart pounding, I plugged the new card into my laptop. It contained a single file, a video. The video was from my personal camera, the one that had been inside the cabin. The timestamp showed it was from the same night. The video was dark, but I could see myself sleeping on the cot. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the cabin door creaked open slowly, silently. The tall, slender figure glided into the room. It moved with an unnatural grace, its feet making no sound on the wooden floor. It approached my cot and stood over me just as in the photograph. It bent down, its blank face hovering over mine. It stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. Then it slowly raised one of its long, spindly hands and reached out, its fingers gently brushing against my cheek. In the video, I stirred in my sleep, a slight frown crossing my face. The creature instantly recoiled, pulling its hand back as if burned. It straightened up, stood perfectly still for a moment, and then, with the same silent grace, it turned and glided out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind it. The video ended. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, a cold, horrifying understanding dawning on me. It hadn't been trying to harm me. It had been curious. It had been studying me, the strange, noisy creature that had invaded its silent world. And whoever or whatever had sent me this video wanted me to know that. They wanted me to know that the creature was still out there. They wanted me to know that it had touched me. I sold all my camera equipment the next day. I moved to a city, a place filled with noise and light and people. A place where the shadows are never deep enough to hide something so tall and so thin. But I know it doesn't matter. I can still feel it sometimes, a phantom touch on my cheek in the middle of the night. The doctors call it post-traumatic stress. They say the mind can create powerful physical sensations. They give my fear a name, a diagnosis, but I know what I saw. And I know that the camera's eye doesn't lie. It just shows you the truth you're not prepared to see. And the truth is, we are not the only predators in the woods. We are just the ones who are foolish enough to believe we are alone. The blizzard hit without warning. A furious white wall that descended from the heavens and swallowed the world whole. One moment, our van was crawling along a lonely mountain pass in the Colorado Rockies. The next, we were blind, lost in a swirling vortex of snow and ice. There were 5 of us returning from a ski trip. Me, David, my girlfriend, Sarah, her brother, Matt. and our friends, Jessica and Kevin. When the van finally skidded off the road and died buried in a snowdrift, panic began its cold creep into our hearts. We were stranded with no cell service and a rapidly dwindling supply of gas to keep the heater running. We knew that staying in the van was a death sentence. Our only hope was a small, dark shape Matt had spotted through a momentary break in the snow just before we crashed. A cabin. Bundled in every layer of clothing we had, we abandoned the van and plunged into the storm. The wind was a physical force, a screaming banshee that tore at our clothes and stole the breath from our lungs. It was a brutal, disorienting trek, but after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon it. A small, dilapidated log cabin half buried in snow. It was a miracle, or so we thought. The door was unlocked. The inside was a single dusty room furnished with nothing but a rickety table, a few chairs, and a large stone fireplace. It was freezing, but it was shelter. We managed to find a small stack of dry firewood and with numb, fumbling fingers got a fire going. As the small flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, a collective sigh of relief went through our small group. We were safe. Our supplies were meager. A few protein bars, a bag of trail mix, and a couple of bottles of water. We rationed them out, knowing we had to make them last. The storm raged for 2 days, an unrelenting assault that shook the very foundations of the old cabin. We huddled together for warmth, our conversations growing shorter, our silences longer. The initial relief of finding shelter was slowly being replaced by a gnawing anxiety. By the 3rd day, the food was gone. The hunger began. It started as a dull ache in the pit of the stomach, a simple biological signal. But in the oppressive silence of the cabin, trapped by the endless white outside, it began to grow into something more. It became a presence, an unseen 6th member of our group, whispering insidious thoughts into our minds. We started looking at each other differently. Every small movement, every quiet sigh was magnified. When Kevin, a big athletic guy, took the last handful of trail mix, I saw a flash of pure animalistic anger in Matt's eyes. Jessica, who was usually so bubbly and cheerful, became withdrawn and sullen, guarding her single remaining protein bar like a treasure. The bonds of friendship, so strong just days before, were beginning to fray under the relentless pressure of starvation. The cabin itself seemed to feed our paranoia. The wind, whistling through the cracks in the logs, sounded like whispers. The shadows thrown by the firelight twisted into grotesque, menacing shapes. We were all on edge, our nerves stretched taut as piano wire. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy window, illuminating a world buried in white. But our relief was short-lived. Kevin was gone. We searched the small cabin, our calls echoing in the stillness. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots were gone. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through the fog of our hunger. Maybe he went for help, Sarah suggested, her voice thin and hopeful. But we all knew that was suicide. The snow was several feet deep, the temperature well below freezing. No one could survive out there for long. Then Matt, who was standing by the door, let out a choked gasp. "Guys, you need to see this." We gathered around him. There in the fresh snow just outside the cabin door was a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin. And next to them, a dark, crimson stain melted into the white, a trail of blood. But the most terrifying part was not the blood itself. It was the fact that the footprints led away from the cabin for about 20 feet, and then they stopped. There were no other tracks, no signs of a struggle, no animal prints. Just the single set of footprints ending abruptly in the middle of the pristine snow. And the trail of blood led from that spot back to the cabin door. The implication was so monstrous, so unthinkable that for a moment no one dared to speak it aloud. "What the hell does that mean?" Jessica whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "It means," Matt said, his voice low and grim, "that whatever happened to him, it came back inside." A new, more terrible kind of fear descended upon us. The fear of the unknown outside was replaced by the certainty of a known threat inside. One of us. The accusation hung unspoken in the air. We looked at each other, our faces masks of suspicion and terror. Who had the strength to overpower Kevin, a man twice the size of anyone else? Who had the savagery to do that? And where was the body? The hunger was no longer just a physical ache. It was a madness, a poison seeping into our minds. I looked at Matt, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room. I looked at Sarah, her face pale, her hands trembling. I looked at Jessica, huddled in the corner, weeping silently. Could one of them be capable of such a thing? Could I? The thought was a cold sliver of ice in my gut. We spent the day in a state of armed truce, each of us watching the others, our hunting knives, which we'd brought for skinning game, now held as weapons. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and our own ragged breathing. As night fell, the terror intensified. No one dared to sleep. We sat in a tense circle around the fire, the flickering light, making our faces look like demonic masks. The cabin, our supposed sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and one of us was the monster. I must have dozed off, my exhaustion finally overpowering my fear. I was woken by a sound, a soft, rhythmic, tearing sound. It was coming from the darkest corner of the cabin. I slowly raised my head, my heart pounding. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, and then I saw it. It was Jessica. She was crouched over something on the floor, her back to me. Her shoulders were shaking with a strange, convulsive movement. The tearing sound was coming from her. She was eating. A wave of revulsion and horror washed over me. I looked around. Matt and Sarah were asleep, huddled together on the other side of the room. I was the only one awake. "Jessica?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She froze. Her head snapped around, her eyes locking onto mine. In the dim firelight, I saw that her face and hands were smeared with blood, and in her hands she was holding a piece of raw red meat. A scream built in my throat, but I choked it back. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. Where had she gotten the meat? Then my eyes fell to the floor next to her. It was Kevin's jacket, and protruding from it was the mangled, half-eaten remains of his arm. She hadn't killed him. She had found him. She had dragged his body back to the cabin and hidden it, carving off pieces to eat in secret. The hunger had driven her to it. She saw the direction of my gaze, and a low, animalistic growl rumbled in her chest. Her eyes, once so full of life, were now flat, feral, the eyes of a starving predator guarding its kill. She held the piece of meat protectively, as if I were trying to take it from her. "He was already dead," she rasped, her voice a dry, cracked whisper. "The cold, it got him. We have to survive." The logic was so twisted, so horrifyingly pragmatic, that it broke something inside me. This wasn't my friend Jessica anymore. This was a creature created by hunger and desperation. I slowly reached for the knife at my belt. She saw the movement and her eyes narrowed. She dropped the piece of meat and lunged at me, her nails like claws, a guttural snarl ripping from her throat. We crashed to the floor. She was surprisingly strong, fueled by a crazed, desperate energy. Her teeth snapped inches from my face. I struggled to get my knife free, to push her off me. The commotion woke Matt and Sarah. They screamed. Matt, seeing what was happening, grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and brought it down hard on Jessica's back. She cried out in pain but didn't release her grip. He hit her again and again. Finally, she went limp, her body slumping on top of me. We dragged her off. She was unconscious but breathing. We tied her up with strips of blanket, our hands shaking, our minds numb with shock and horror. We had survived the night, but the cabin was now a true house of horrors. In one corner lay the bound and unconscious form of our friend, a cannibal. In the other, the gruesome, half-eaten remains of another. The next day, a rescue helicopter, alerted by our families, found the cabin. They airlifted us out, leaving the grim scene behind for the authorities to deal with. The official story was that Kevin had died of exposure, and Jessica, in a state of starvation-induced psychosis, had resorted to cannibalism. It was a neat, tidy explanation that fit into the known parameters of human psychology. They called it survival psychosis. They gave the horror a name. Sarah and Matt and I tried to move on, but we were haunted. We had seen what lies just beneath the thin veneer of civilization. We had looked into the eyes of the hunger, and it had looked back at us. Jessica was committed to a psychiatric institution. They said she would recover, that she was a victim of extreme trauma. But I know what I saw in her eyes that night. It wasn't just madness. It was something older, something primal. Sometimes I wonder, was it just the hunger that drove her to it? Or was there something else in that cabin, something ancient and malevolent, whispering in the wind, feeding on our desperation, turning us against each other? The doctors have their explanations, their tidy labels, but they weren't there. They didn't feel the oppressive silence or see the shadows dance like demons in the firelight. They didn't feel the cold, gnawing presence of the hunger itself. I was there, and I know that some hungers can never truly be satisfied. The place was called Winter's End, a charmingly ironic name for a cabin we'd rented for the peak of the ski season. Nestled deep in the snow-drenched mountains of Vermont, it was supposed to be the perfect getaway for my friends and me. There were 4 of us, me, Alex, my girlfriend Maya, and another couple, Liam and Chloe. We were celebrating our college graduation, one last hurrah before scattering to different cities and starting our adult lives. The online listing promised a cozy, rustic experience with a massive stone fireplace as its centerpiece, the perfect spot to thaw out after a long day on the slopes. We arrived on a Friday afternoon as a gentle snow was beginning to fall. The cabin was beautiful, a classic A-frame with huge windows looking out over a valley of snow-laden pines. Inside, it was even better. The air smelled of cedar and pine, and the promised fireplace was a magnificent beast of river stone and dark mortar dominating the main living area. "This is perfect," Chloe said, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "First things first, let's get that fire going." The previous tenants had left a generous stack of seasoned oak by the hearth. Liam, always the designated fire guy, expertly arranged the logs on the iron grate, stuffed kindling underneath, and struck a match. The kindling caught immediately, and soon, bright, cheerful flames were licking at the larger logs. We all gathered around, rubbing our hands together, anticipating the wave of warmth that would soon fill the room. But it never came. The fire grew, the flames dancing and roaring, a vibrant spectacle of orange and yellow. It looked like a perfect fire. It sounded like a perfect fire, but it produced no heat. We huddled closer, our hands outstretched, feeling nothing but the biting cold of the room. "That's weird," Liam said, frowning. "Maybe the wood is damp." "It's burning fine," I countered, watching the logs turn to glowing red embers. "It should be blasting heat right now." We chalked it up to a strange draft or the initial deep cold of the cabin. We put on extra layers, made hot chocolate, and tried to ignore it. But as the hours passed and the fire continued to burn with its strange, heatless intensity, a subtle unease began to creep in. The centerpiece of our cozy winter retreat was broken in a way none of us could understand. That night, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Despite the roaring fire, we could see our breath in the air. We piled every blanket we could find onto our beds, sleeping in our ski jackets and beanies. I woke up several times, shivering, my body aching with a deep, penetrating cold that felt like it was coming from inside my bones. The fire in the hearth was still blazing, its silent, mocking flames casting long, dancing shadows on the frost-covered walls. The next morning, we were all exhausted and irritable. The cold had seeped into our very being, leaving us feeling drained and lethargic. "I've never felt cold like this," Maya said, her teeth chattering as she tried to sip her coffee. "It's like the fire is, I don't know, just for show." "It's worse than that," Liam said, his face pale. He was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Come here." We gathered around him. "Feel the air right in front of it," he instructed. I held my hand out just a foot from the roaring fire. The air was colder, not just room temperature, but actively, unnaturally colder, like standing in front of an open freezer. The fire wasn't just failing to produce heat, it was actively consuming it. A jolt of real fear, cold and sharp, shot through me. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't damp wood. This was something deeply, fundamentally wrong. "We should just put it out," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "It's freaking me out." But the thought of being in the cabin without even the illusion of a fire was somehow worse. The flames, however useless, were a psychological comfort, a single point of light against the oppressive cold and the encroaching darkness of the winter evening. We decided to spend the day on the slopes, hoping the physical activity and the bright mountain sun would warm us up and clear our heads. But the bone-deep chill followed us. We felt sluggish, our movements clumsy, our energy reserves depleted. We cut the day short and returned to the cabin, dreading the coming night. As we walked in, the cold hit us like a physical blow. It was far colder inside the cabin with its blazing fire than it was outside on the mountain. And we were all so tired. The exhaustion was profound, a heavy leaden weight on our limbs. I can't get warm," Chloe stammered, slumping into a chair near the fire. Her skin was waxy and pale. "We're all freezing," Liam said, his own movements slow and deliberate. "Maybe we're getting sick. Hypothermia?" "It can't be," I argued, though my own thoughts were becoming sluggish. "The thermostat says it's 50 degrees in here. We shouldn't be this cold." But we were. The cold was a living thing, and its source was the beautiful, terrible fire in the hearth. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on the warmth of the room, on the warmth of our bodies. "We have to put it out," Maya said, her voice firm despite her shivering. "Now." Liam stumbled to the kitchen and returned with a large pot of water. He stood before the hearth, his body swaying with exhaustion. He looked at the flames, and for a moment he hesitated. The fire was mesmerizing, its colors vibrant, its movement hypnotic. It was hard to look away. It felt welcoming. "Liam, do it!" I yelled, the effort making my head spin. He snapped out of his trance and threw the water onto the logs. There was a loud hiss, a cloud of steam, and the flames vanished, leaving behind a pile of blackened, sizzling logs. For a moment, there was silence. Then the cold intensified. It was a solid, crushing presence, a physical weight that pressed in on us from all sides. Without the fire's focused consumption, the cold was now everywhere, seeping from the walls, the floor, the very air we were breathing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. "What's happening?" Chloe cried, her voice thin with panic. "We made it angry," Liam whispered, his eyes wide with terror. The exhaustion was overwhelming now. It was a struggle just to stand, to think. My limbs felt like they were filled with slush. I looked at my friends. Their faces were gaunt, their lips tinged with blue. We were dying. The cold was killing us. We have to get out, I managed to say, my words slurring. Get to the car. It was a monumental effort, like moving through deep water. We fumbled for our jackets and boots, our fingers too numb and clumsy to work the zippers and laces properly. Every movement was a battle against a crushing, invisible force that wanted us to lie down, to close our eyes, to sleep. Maya stumbled and fell. She didn't try to get up. "I'm so tired, Alex," she murmured, her eyes fluttering shut. Just for a minute." "No!" I screamed, adrenaline cutting through the fog in my brain. I knelt and shook her, my own movements clumsy and weak. "Maya, stay with me. We have to move." Somehow we managed to get her to her feet. Leaning on each other, we half carried, half dragged ourselves to the door. I fumbled with the lock, my frozen fingers refusing to cooperate. Finally, it clicked open. We stumbled out into the night. The air outside, which should have been freezing, felt almost balmy in comparison to the soul-crushing cold of the cabin. We gasped, our lungs burning, but the air felt clean, alive. We were still freezing, still dangerously hypothermic, but the malevolent parasitic cold was gone. We made it to the car. I have no memory of starting it, of driving down the treacherous mountain road. The next thing I knew, we were in the emergency room of a small-town hospital, wrapped in thermal blankets, doctors and nurses bustling around us. They diagnosed us with severe, near-fatal hypothermia. The doctor was baffled. "Your core temperatures were dangerously low," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen cases from people lost in the wilderness for days who weren't this bad. It's like you were flash frozen." "What happened in that cabin?" We tried to explain. We told him about the fire that gave no heat, about the cold that felt like it was feeding on us. He listened patiently, a look of professional sympathy on his face. His final report was logical, scientific. He concluded that the cabin's chimney must have had a severe, undocumented structural flaw, a reverse draft phenomenon, he called it, that was siphoning all the heat out of the room and pulling in frigid outside air at an accelerated rate. Our lethargy and confusion, he explained, were classic symptoms of advanced hypothermia, which can cause hallucinations and paranoia. It was a freak environmental accident. We clung to that explanation. We had to. It was the only way to make sense of the horror, to put it in a box we could understand. We all recovered physically, but the cold never really left us. It lives in our bones, a phantom chill that creeps up on us on warm summer days. We never had our one last hurrah. The experience shattered something between us. We rarely speak now. When we do, we never ever talk about that weekend. To acknowledge it is to acknowledge the possibility that the doctor was wrong. I know he was wrong. I know what I felt in that cabin. It wasn't a draft. It was a presence. It was a hunger, as real and as ravenous as any predator. It was an ancient cold, a fire that burned not with heat, but with a chilling, life-stealing appetite. The doctors gave our experience a name, a scientific label to make it safe. But they weren't there. They didn't see the beautiful, terrible flames dance. They didn't feel its cold, empty stomach as it fed on our warmth, our energy, our lives. I was there, and I know that some fires are not meant to give warmth. Some fires are only meant to consume. My father, Tom, always had a flair for the dramatic. In the fall of 1988, he announced he'd booked a weekend getaway for the family. No Nintendo, no VCR, no afternoon cartoons, just us, nature, and a remote cabin in the wilds of Oregon. My mom, Sarah, my younger sister, Lily, and I were less than thrilled. The cabin was called Serenity Peak, a name that, looking back, was a piece of exceptionally cruel irony. The place had a history, of course. Dad, a history professor with a morbid fascination for the macabre, had chosen it specifically for that reason. Back in '68, 20 years prior, it had been the site of a mass suicide. A small, obscure cult calling themselves the Children of the Silent Word had gathered there to perform a ritual. Their leader, a charismatic man named Elias Thorne, had promised them they could summon a being of immense power, a patron of the quiet places, by sacrificing their voices to it. They were all found dead, having ingested a potent poison. The official report from the time said the ritual had failed. "It's a fascinating piece of local folklore," Dad explained cheerfully as our wood-paneled station wagon rattled up the winding, unpaved road, the cassette player whining a worn-out Springsteen tape. "A testament to the power of shared delusion." The cabin was isolated, perched on a ridge overlooking a vast, silent forest. It was old, the logs dark with age but seemed sturdy. Inside it was clean, almost sterile, as if someone had tried to scrub its dark history from the very wood. We unpacked, and for the first few hours it was almost peaceful. We played a dusty copy of Trivial Pursuit. Dad read a paperback and Lily drew in her sketchbook with a set of crayons. The only sound was the wind whispering through the tall pines outside. The first sign that something was wrong came after dinner. We were sitting around the crackling fireplace when Lily suddenly looked up from her drawing, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked. We all paused, listening. "Hear what, sweetie?" Mom asked, her knitting needles clicking softly. "A scream," Lily said, her voice trembling slightly. It was really loud. We listened again. Nothing. Just the wind and the fire. Dad chuckled. "It's an old cabin, Lily. They make strange noises. Your mind is just playing tricks on you because of the stories." Lily seemed unconvinced, but she didn't press the issue. Later that night, as I was drifting off to sleep on a lumpy cot, I heard it too. It wasn't a sound that came through my ears. It was a sharp, piercing shriek that erupted directly inside my skull. It was so sudden and so loud that I physically flinched, my whole body tensing. I sat up, my heart pounding, but the cabin was silent. I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks, a weird dream. I was just letting Dad's ghost stories get to me. The next morning, the real horror began. I woke up to the smell of percolating coffee. I walked into the main room to see Mom and Dad sitting at the table having a conversation. Or at least, I thought they were. Their mouths were moving. They were gesturing, looking at each other, but I couldn't hear a single word. It was like watching a TV with the sound turned all the way down. "What's going on?" I asked, my own voice sounding loud and strange in the silence. They both turned to look at me, their expressions confused. Dad's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. He pointed to his ears and shook his head. Mom did the same, a look of growing panic on her face. I stared at them, a cold dread seeping into my bones. I could hear myself. I could hear the floorboards creak under my feet, but I couldn't hear them. Lily came out of her room, rubbing her eyes. "Why is everyone being so quiet?" she asked. I turned to her. "I can hear you," I said, relief washing over me. "But I can't hear you," she replied, her lower lip beginning to tremble. "Your mouth is moving, but there's no sound." The horrifying reality of our situation crashed down on us. We were trapped in our own individual bubbles of silence. I could hear Lily, but not my parents. Lily could hear our parents, but not me. Our parents could hear each other, but not us. It was a bizarre, fractured deafness, a selective silence that made no logical sense. And then, the screams started again. This time, they weren't fleeting. They were a constant, agonizing chorus inside my head. The screams of men, women, and children, a symphony of torment that was audible only to me. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The sound wasn't external. It was being broadcast directly into my consciousness. I looked at my family. I could see the same terror reflected in their eyes. Lily was crying, her silent sobs shaking her small body. Mom was holding Dad's arm, her face a mask of disbelief. Dad was trying to stay calm, but I could see the raw fear behind his academic composure. They were hearing it too. Each of us trapped in our own private hell of silent screams. The day was a descent into madness. Communication became a frustrating, terrifying pantomime. We tried writing notes on a pad of paper, but our hands were shaking too badly, our thoughts too fractured by the incessant screaming in our heads. The silence between us was a chasm, and the screams were the only bridge. Suspicion began to fester. I would see my parents talking, their expressions urgent, and the paranoia would whisper in my ear. They can hear each other. They're plotting against you. They know something you don't. I would look at Lily, her eyes wide with a fear I couldn't comfort, and I would wonder what she was hearing, what silent horrors were playing out in her mind. The cabin, once a symbol of rustic charm, became a prison. The silent forest outside was no longer beautiful. It was menacing, a vast empty space that seemed to mock our inability to connect. We were four people in a small room, more isolated from each other than if we were on different continents. The screams were the worst part. They were relentless, a tapestry of pain woven into the fabric of my thoughts. I could distinguish different voices. A man's deep, guttural roar of agony, a woman's high-pitched shriek of terror, a child's desperate, helpless wail. It was the sound of souls being torn apart. By nightfall, we were all on the verge of breaking. Dad, in a desperate attempt to find a rational explanation, found an old leather-bound journal in a dusty bookshelf. It was the journal of Elias Thorne, the cult leader. He sat at the table, his face illuminated by a single kerosene lantern, and began to read. We gathered around, watching his face, trying to glean some meaning from his expressions. He would read a page, his eyes widening in horror, and then frantically write a summary for us on the notepad. The journal revealed the true nature of the cult's ritual. Thorne hadn't been trying to summon a being. He had been trying to become one. He believed that by sacrificing the voices of his followers, he could absorb their life essence and transcend his human form, becoming the patron of the quiet places himself. He had engineered a selective poison, one that would paralyze the vocal cords before killing the body, ensuring their last moments were spent in silent agony. The final entry was chilling. Thorne wrote that the ritual was working, but not as he expected. He could feel a presence, an ancient, malevolent consciousness that had been drawn by their silent screams. It was not a patron. It was a parasite, a being that fed on sound, on communication, on the very essence of connection. He wrote that it was taking their voices not as a sacrifice, but as sustenance. His last words, scrawled in a frantic, barely legible hand, were, "It's not silent. It's hungry. It's still here." Dad dropped the pen, his face ashen. He looked at us, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding. The cult hadn't failed. They had succeeded in summoning something, and it had never left. It had been here for 20 years, dormant, starving, waiting. And we had walked right into its hunting ground. It wasn't just taking our ability to hear each other, it was feeding on it. The screams in our heads were the echoes of the cultists, their final moments of torment replayed for us. A psychological torture designed to break us down, to make us more susceptible. The realization shattered the last vestiges of our sanity. Lily began to scream, a silent, desperate shriek that I could see but not hear. Mom was rocking back and forth, her hands over her ears, a futile gesture against the internal assault. I looked at my father. He was staring at the journal, then at the fireplace, a strange, desperate idea forming in his eyes. He grabbed the journal and a pen and wrote a single frantic note. Sound. It hates sound. We have to be louder than the screams. He began to smash things. He threw a chair against the wall. He swept the heavy lantern off a table, its glass shattering, the flame thankfully extinguishing on the stone floor. The sounds were jarring, explosive in the oppressive silence of my mind, but they were real, external sounds. For a glorious, fleeting moment, the screams in my head subsided, drowned out by the crash. We all understood. It was a war of noise. We had to fight the silence with sound. We joined him in his frenzy. We banged cast iron pots and pans together. We overturned furniture. We slammed doors. We screamed, even though we couldn't hear ourselves, our raw, voiceless cries a desperate act of rebellion. It was chaos, a symphony of destruction, but it was working. The more noise we made, the weaker the internal screams became, but the entity fought back. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. The screams in my head redoubled their intensity, trying to overwhelm the real-world noise. It was a battle for my sanity, for my very soul. In the midst of the chaos, I saw it. For just a second, reflected in the glass of a broken picture frame, I saw a shape in the corner of the room. It was a distortion, a patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the light, a void in the shape of a man. It had no features, but I could feel its ancient, malevolent attention focused on us, its hunger a palpable force in the room. We knew we couldn't keep it up forever. Our makeshift weapons of noise would eventually fall silent, and our energy was fading fast. Our only hope was to escape. "The car!" I scrawled on the wall with a piece of charcoal from the fireplace. We fought our way to the door, a desperate, stumbling retreat. The cabin seemed to resist, the air growing thick and heavy, the silence pushing against us like a physical barrier. We burst out into the cold night air, the real, natural silence of the forest, a shocking, blessed relief. The screams in my head vanished, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. We scrambled into the station wagon. Dad fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine turned over, its roar the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. We sped away from that cursed place, leaving the silent cabin and its hungry occupant behind. We didn't stop driving until we saw the lights of the first town. We pulled into a payphone booth at a gas station, and I stumbled out of the car. "Can you hear me?" I asked my dad, my voice hoarse. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I can hear you," he whispered. We could all hear each other again. We stood there under the harsh yellow light of the gas station. A family broken and remade by an impossible horror, clinging to the simple, beautiful gift of sound. The official explanation, the one we gave the sheriff, the one we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night, is that there was a gas leak from the old propane heater in the cabin. They said it can cause auditory hallucinations, confusion, paranoia, all the things we experienced. It's a neat scientific explanation. It puts the horror in a box. But they weren't there. They didn't hear the screams inside their own skulls. They didn't feel the life-draining silence or see the void in the corner of the room. I was there, and I know that some places are not empty. They are just quiet, waiting. And some screams are so loud they don't need to make a sound at all. In the autumn of 1978, the world was a haze of corduroy prog rock and a cynical post-Watergate hangover. My name is Arthur Ainsworth, and I was a graduate student in archaeology at Northgate University. Along with three of my peers, the pragmatic, no-nonsense Thomas Sterling, the sharp but anxious linguist Eleanor Vance, and the perpetually laid-back history major Charlie Davies, I was chosen for a unique field study. Our destination wasn't some exotic dig site, but a dilapidated log cabin deep in the sprawling, forgotten forests of the Adirondacks. The cabin was the last known location of Professor Alastair Finch, a man who had been a star in the archaeology world before his career took a nosedive into the occult. 5 years ago, he had vanished from this very spot. Finch wasn't just interested in ancient cultures, he wanted to experience their beliefs firsthand. His final self-funded expedition was to this cabin, which he claimed was built on a confluence, a place where the barrier between our world and something else was thin. He disappeared, leaving behind a trunk of research and a career in ruins. Our mission, as assigned by the department head, was simple. Drive up in Charlie's beat-up Ford van, catalog Finch's final notes, and officially debunk his fringe theories. The university wanted to close the book on the embarrassing Finch episode for good. The van could only take us so far. The last few miles were a hike along a muddy, overgrown trail. The cabin stood in a clearing, looking grim and waterlogged under a perpetually gray sky. The air was thick and smelled of pine rot and damp earth. It felt like a place the rest of the world had agreed to forget. The inside was a mess, a testament to a brilliant mind unraveling. Books on demonology and forgotten languages were stacked everywhere. Topographic maps were tacked to the walls, covered in frantic annotations and strange symbols. In the center of the room, a complex circle had been crudely carved into the floorboards, its grooves filled with a dark, flaky substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood. For 2 days, we worked by the light of battery-powered lanterns, sorting through Finch's chaotic papers. It was mostly what we expected: paranoid ramblings and half-baked theories. But on the third evening, as a cold, steady rain began to drum on the roof, Eleanor found it. A heavy, lead-lined footlocker was hidden under a loose floorboard. Inside was Professor Finch's personal journal. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his neat but increasingly agitated handwriting. We gathered around the rough-hewn table, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. This was the primary document we'd been sent to retrieve. With a sense of academic purpose, and I'll admit a cheap thrill, I opened it to the first page and began to read aloud for the group to transcribe. The early entries were dry, detailing his arrival and his geological surveys. He wrote about the oppressive silence of the forest, a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. He was convinced the cabin's location was no accident, that it sat on a focal point of immense unseen energy. Then the tone changed. Finch claimed he had discovered a complete transcription of a medieval summoning ritual, a text so dangerous it was thought to have been purged from history. His goal was to perform it and call forth an entity he referred to as the Silent Orator, a demon said to whisper forgotten truths directly into the mind of the summoner. "This is nuts," Tom said, running a hand through his shaggy hair. "The guy came out here and went completely crazy. Case closed." "Let him read, Tom," Eleanor said, her voice quiet. She was leaning forward, her eyes fixed on the journal as if mesmerized. I kept reading. Finch detailed his preparations, carving the circle, the ritual fasting, the strange items he'd gathered. He described the ritual itself as a vocal catalyst. It was a long narrative incantation that had to be spoken aloud from start to finish on a moonless night. The very act of speaking the words, he theorized, tuned the human voice to a specific frequency, a frequency that would unlock a door not meant to be opened. As I read his description of the incantation, a sudden frigid gust of wind swept through the cabin, making the lantern flames sputter wildly. We had bolted the door and jammed rags in the window cracks to keep the cold out. It made no sense. Charlie let out a nervous laugh. "Spooky," he said, but the word hung empty in the air. The temperature in the room had definitely dropped. My voice was a little less steady as I continued. The journal moved to the night of the ritual. Finch wrote of beginning the incantation, his voice feeling alien and powerful in the small space. He described the air growing thick, like breathing in static, and a low, dissonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very logs of the cabin. As I read that passage, we heard it too. A low-frequency hum, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of our boots. It was a feeling as much as a sound. On a nearby shelf, a tin coffee mug rattled and then fell to the floor with a loud clatter, making us all jump. "Okay, that's it," Tom said, standing up. His skepticism was visibly cracking. "This is just a drafty old shack and our minds are playing tricks on us. Let's pack this up." But no one moved. We were all on edge. Eleanor was pale, hugging her arms to her chest. Even Charlie's easygoing grin was gone, replaced by a look of wide-eyed concern. "We have a job to do," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "Let's just get through the journal." I forced myself to continue. Finch's handwriting grew wilder. He described the blood-filled symbols in the circle beginning to pulse with a faint, nauseating green light. He wrote of the shadows in the room seeming to pull away from the lantern, gathering in the center of the circle like a pool of oil. As my voice gave life to his words, we watched in abject horror as the dark lines on the floor began to emit a soft, sickly emerald glow. The hum grew louder and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and deepen as if the lantern light was being physically pushed back. That's when the horrifying, impossible realization hit me. My voice trembled, but the words kept coming as if they had a will of their own. The journal wasn't just a record of the ritual, the detailed first-person narrative of the incantation. It was the incantation itself. Finch had designed it so that anyone reading his final testimony aloud would be, unknowingly, finishing what he had started. "Arthur, stop!" Eleanor shrieked, scrambling back from the table. "You're saying it! You're performing the ritual!" But I couldn't. It felt like my jaw was locked, my tongue moving on its own accord. My eyes were fixed on the page, my voice a hollow drone reciting the ancient guttural phrases. The air became glacial, our breath misting in the lantern light. The symbols on the floor now blazed with a lurid, unnatural intensity, and the hum escalated into a low, grinding roar that made the whole cabin vibrate. The pool of shadow in the center of the circle began to churn. A form started to rise from it, something tall and skeletal with limbs that bent at wrong angles. It had no face, just a smooth, dark void where a head should be. Charlie, ever the jock, acted on pure instinct. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the cold fireplace. "Get away from them, you son of a bitch!" he yelled, charging the circle. He swung the poker with all his might. But as the iron bar crossed the glowing threshold of the circle, it simply dissolved into a puff of black dust. The faceless thing didn't even react. It slowly turned its blank head toward him. Charlie froze, his mouth open, his eyes wide with a terror no human should ever witness. He made a small, choked sound, and then his body just deflated, collapsing to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Tom screamed a raw, primal sound of pure terror and bolted for the door. He threw the heavy bar and wrenched it open, but the doorway didn't reveal the rainy night. It revealed a solid, impenetrable wall of silent, starless black. The cabin was no longer in the Adirondacks. It was adrift in nothing. The entity in the circle turned its void-like head toward Eleanor and me. With a surge of adrenaline, I finally broke the spell. I slammed the journal shut and hurled it across the room. The humming stopped. The green light died. The shape in the circle wavered, looking less solid. But the door to nowhere was still open. "The window!" I screamed, grabbing Eleanor's arm. We smashed a wooden chair through the grimy glass pane. We scrambled through the opening, cutting ourselves on the shards, and fell onto the wet, muddy ground. We were back. The forest was all around us. Behind us, the cabin stood, its open doorway a perfect, terrifying rectangle of absolute blackness. We ran. We ran without looking back, branches whipping at our faces, our lungs on fire. We ran from the cabin, from the sight of Charlie's empty form on the floor. from the impossible void that had taken Tom. We ran until the sun came up, its weak, watery light the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We stumbled out of the woods 2 days later, dehydrated and half mad with trauma. The story we told the state troopers was a carefully constructed lie, a sudden, violent storm, a flash flood. Charlie and Tom tragically swept away. It was a lie, but it was a lie the world could understand. The truth was a story no one would ever believe. The university sealed Finch's records. The official story was that the 4 of us had been caught in a storm and 2 had tragically perished. The cabin was left to rot, a forgotten monument to a failed expedition. I'm a different man now. I left academia. I can't stand quiet rooms or deep forests. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, I can almost feel that low, vibrating hum in the floorboards. I can see the sickly green glow behind my eyelids, and I know, with a certainty that freezes the blood in my veins, that we didn't banish anything that night. We just closed a book. We never closed the door. It was We were trying to escape, not from anything dramatic, just the slow, grinding pressure of city life. My name is Ben, and my wife Chloe and I had rented a cabin for a week. It was one of those ultra-modern, minimalist places advertised on a trendy travel blog, nestled deep in the forests of Washington state. Its main selling point was a massive floor-to-ceiling window that made up the entire back wall of the living room, offering a panoramic, uninterrupted view of the dense, ancient woods. The listing called it "Living in Nature." We would soon learn how terrifyingly accurate that was. We arrived on a Monday afternoon, the air crisp and smelling of pine and damp earth. The cabin was stunning, a sleek black box dropped into a sea of green. The inside was just as advertised. Polished concrete floors, a sleek kitchen, and that enormous window. It was like a movie screen, the forest its constant silent film. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, we felt a profound sense of peace. We had made the right choice. That night we sat on the sofa, a bottle of wine between us, the lights low, just watching the woods. The moon was bright, casting a silvery, ethereal glow on the trees. It was around 10 p.m. when Chloe first saw it. She stiffened beside me, her wine glass pausing halfway to her lips. "What was that?" she whispered. "What was what?" I asked, my eyes scanning the forest. "I thought I saw someone," she said, pointing, "out there by that cluster of birch trees." I followed her finger. The birch trees stood out, their white bark like bones in the moonlight. At first, I saw nothing but a chaotic tangle of trunks and branches. But then, I focused, and I saw it. It wasn't a person, not clearly. It was a shape, a vertical slash of darkness that didn't belong. It was tall, unnaturally so, and perfectly still. It was just beyond the edge of the property line, where the manicured clearing met the untamed wilderness. "Probably just a weirdly shaped tree trunk," I said, trying to sound convincing. "The moonlight is playing tricks." "No," Chloe insisted, her voice tight. "It wasn't there before. It's watching us." A cold prickle of unease ran down my spine. She was right. There was an unnerving sense of stillness about it, an intentionality. It didn't look like a tree, it looked like something pretending to be a shadow. We watched it for 10 minutes, our wine forgotten. It didn't move. Not an inch. "This is ridiculous," I finally said, standing up. "I'm calling the sheriff. Probably just some local kid trying to spook the city folk." The local sheriff's deputy, a world-weary man named Peterson, arrived about 40 minutes later. He was polite but clearly unimpressed. We explained what we saw, pointing to the spot. He swept the area with a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Don't see anything, folks," he said, his voice flat. "No tracks either. Like you said, probably just the shadows playing tricks." "This forest is old. It does weird things to your eyes at night." He was right. When he shone his light on the spot, there was nothing there, just trees. The dark shape was gone. We felt foolish, like paranoid city dwellers who didn't understand the country. We thanked him and he left, advising us to keep the curtains closed if we were feeling jumpy. The problem was the cabin didn't have any curtains for the main window. That was the whole point. We went to bed feeling unsettled, but we convinced ourselves the deputy was right. The next day we hiked, we cooked, we read. We tried to recapture the peace we'd felt upon arrival, and for the most part we succeeded. But as night fell again, a sense of dread began to creep back in. We found ourselves avoiding the living room, staying in the kitchen where the windows were smaller. Around 9:30 p.m. when we forced ourselves to go look, it was back, but it was closer. Last night it had been at the edge of the forest, at least 100 yards away. Tonight it stood just inside the clearing, halfway between the woods and the cabin. It was still just a tall, dark shape, devoid of features, but its proximity made it infinitely more menacing. It was perfectly still, a silent black monolith against the moonlit grass. "Okay, this isn't funny," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. She was gripping my arm, her knuckles white. It's got to be a prank," I said, but my own heart was hammering. Who would stand out there for hours, perfectly still in the freezing cold? We didn't call the police this time. What would we say? That the shadow had moved? They already thought we were crazy. Instead, we did the only thing we could think of. We turned off all the lights inside, hoping that if it couldn't see us, it would leave. We retreated to the bedroom, locked the door, and spent a sleepless night listening to the silence, imagining every creak of the house was a footstep. The next morning it was gone. The clearing was empty. But there was a new chilling detail. On the damp grass, there was a single straight line of flattened, dead grass leading from the edge of the woods to the spot where the figure had stood. It wasn't a trail. It was a single, unblemished path, as if something had slid or glided over the ground without taking a single step. We should have left then. Every rational instinct screamed at us to pack our bags and drive away. But there's a strange, stubborn part of the human mind that refuses to accept the impossible. We told ourselves it was a prank, a very elaborate and cruel one. We decided to stay one more night to catch whoever was doing this. We were angry now, our fear curdling into a defiant resolve. That day, I set up my DSLR camera on a tripod, pointing it at the window, programming it to take a picture every minute. If someone was out there, I was going to get proof. As the sun began to set, on our third night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. We didn't even pretend to relax. We sat on the sofa, our backs to the window, trying to read, but our eyes kept darting towards the reflection in the darkened glass. At 9:00 p.m. sharp, Chloe gasped. I looked at the reflection. It was there. It was on the deck. It stood not 10 feet from the glass, a towering, impossibly thin silhouette against the moonlit sky. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It had no discernible arms or head, just a long, slender, black form that seemed to drink the light around it. The sheer wrongness of it, the violation of seeing it on the deck, in our space, was paralyzing. It didn't move. It just stood there, a silent sentinel of dread. We were trapped, mice in a glass cage, and the cat was at the window. We didn't speak. We barely breathed. We were frozen in place, our eyes locked on the reflection. My camera clicked softly every minute, a tiny mechanical sound in the crushing silence. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. It remained perfectly still, a statue carved from nightmare. Then it moved. It wasn't a step. It glided, a slow, fluid motion until its face, the upper part of its form, was pressed directly against the glass. There was no sound, no tap, no scrape, just a silent, horrifying arrival. We could see it clearly now. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth, black, shifting surface, like a column of smoke trapped in human form. Chloe let out a choked sob. The sound seemed to break the spell. We scrambled backward, falling over the sofa. Crab walking away from the window, our eyes still locked on the thing that was watching us without eyes. It stayed there, pressed against the glass for what felt like an eternity. It was studying us. We were an exhibit, and it was a curious observer. The terror was absolute, a pure primal fear that hollowed me out completely. Then, as slowly as it had arrived, it glided back from the window, across the deck, and into the clearing. It paused for a moment, then retreated back into the darkness of the forest and was gone. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed our car keys and our wallets and ran. We didn't pack. We just fled, leaving everything else behind. We drove all night, not stopping until the sun was up and we were hundreds of miles away, surrounded by the noise and safety of a bustling city. A week later, back in our apartment, I finally worked up the courage to look at the photos from the camera. I had called the rental company and paid an exorbitant fee for them to pack up our belongings and ship them to us, including the camera. I plugged the memory card into my computer, my hands trembling. The first series of photos showed the empty living room, then the empty deck as dusk fell. Then at 9:00 p.m., it appeared. A black shape on the deck. The subsequent photos showed it standing there unmoving. Then the sequence, where it glided to the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the close-up, the smooth, featureless surface, the unnatural height. It was all there. It was real. I kept clicking through the photos, my heart pounding. It retreated. It was gone from the deck. The next photo showed the empty deck, and the next. I felt a wave of relief. Then I got to the last photo. The camera, in its final shot before we fled, had caught a reflection in the glass. A reflection of the room behind it. A reflection of the sofa we had been sitting on. And standing right behind the sofa, right where we had been sitting just moments before, was the man from the window. We never went back. The police report we filed from the city was dismissed as the ramblings of frightened tourists. They said they found no evidence of a prowler. The rental company charged us for a broken lamp. Life, for the most part, went on. But the doctors have a name for what I have now. Agoraphobia, a fear of open spaces. I can't handle large windows anymore. I live in a basement apartment. Chloe and I separated. She couldn't live with the constant fear, the man I had become. They say trauma can rewire the brain. They say the mind can play powerful tricks. They have rational explanations for my paranoia, for my insistence on living in a dark, enclosed space. But they didn't see what I saw on that memory card. They didn't see the final photograph. They don't understand that the most terrifying thing wasn't the man in the window. It was the moment I realized he could come inside whenever he wanted. He was just being polite. He was just waiting. It was supposed to be a postcard Christmas. My wife, Sarah, our 7-year-old son, Leo, and I had rented a cabin in the deep woods of Montana, a place promising seclusion, snow, and a crackling fireplace. The plan was simple: escape the city, build snowmen, drink hot chocolate, and forget the world for a week. The world, however, had other plans. We arrived on a Thursday, the sky a brilliant cloudless blue. The cabin was perfect. A classic log structure with a wide porch and a plume of welcoming smoke already rising from its stone chimney, courtesy of the caretaker who had prepped it for us. The first 2 days were idyllic. We were a family in a snow globe, sealed off and perfect. The forecast had called for a major snowstorm to roll in on Saturday, but we were prepared. We had enough food, firewood, and board games to last a siege. We felt safe, insulated. We were fools. The storm hit Saturday night, a furious, howling blizzard that shook the cabin and buried the world in a sea of white. We woke up Sunday morning to an eerie silence. The wind had died, and the snow had stopped. Outside, the landscape was transformed, a pristine, untouched wilderness blanketed in at least 3 feet of fresh powder. The beauty of it was breathtaking and absolute. It was Leo who saw them first. He was standing on a chair, peering out the kitchen window. "Dad," he said, his voice small and curious. "Who was walking outside?" I joined him at the window, a coffee mug warming my hands. "No one, buddy, we're snowed in." "But there are footprints," he insisted. I looked, and a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. He was right. There in the perfect unbroken snow was a single neat circle of footprints enclosing the entire cabin. They were about 50 yards out, a perfect, deliberate ring. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The prints were of bare human feet, and there was no trail leading to the circle and no trail leading away. It was as if someone had been dropped from the sky, walked a perfect circle around our cabin, and then been lifted away again. "It must be from before the last snowfall," Sarah said, joining us. But her voice lacked conviction. We all knew the snow had only stopped a few hours ago. These prints were fresh, crisp, and impossibly deep. "Who would be out here barefoot in a blizzard?" I muttered, more to myself than to them. The question hung in the cold air, unanswered. We spent the day trying to rationalize it. A prank by a local? Some strange animal track we didn't recognize? But the prints were undeniably human. The absurdity of it was what was so terrifying, the sheer illogical patience of it. We tried to ignore them, but they were always there, a silent, circular siege line. Every time I looked out a window, my eyes were drawn to that impossible trail. That night, none of us slept well. Every creak of the settling logs, every whisper of wind sounded like a footstep in the snow. On Monday morning, the dread returned, colder and sharper. The first circle of footprints was still there, slightly softened by the wind. But now there was a second one. It was inside the first, about 40 yards from the cabin. Another perfect circle of bare footprints in the snow. Again, no trail leading to or from it. The visitor had returned in the dead of night, unseen and unheard, and had simply walked another tighter circle around us. "This isn't a prank," Sarah whispered, her face pale. She was holding Leo, shielding his eyes from the window, but he had already seen them. "Dad, he's getting closer," Leo said, his voice trembling. He was right. The methodical, patient advance was the most terrifying part. This wasn't a random act. It was a process, a countdown. The snow was our prison, and the footprints were the tightening of the bars. We were completely cut off. The phone line was dead, and our car was a useless lump under a mountain of snow. We were utterly, completely alone with whatever was out there. We spent the day in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound. We kept the curtains drawn, but that was almost worse. The not knowing, the imagining was a special kind of torture. What was it? A person, a madman, or something else? Why was it barefoot? Why the circles? The questions gnawed at us, chipping away at our sanity. That night I sat in the dark living room, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace clutched in my hand, my eyes fixed on the black rectangle of the main window. I was determined to see it. I had to know what we were facing. I sat there for hours, my body rigid, my ears straining, until exhaustion finally claimed me and I drifted into a fitful sleep in the armchair. I woke with a start just before dawn on Tuesday. The cabin was silent. I scrambled to the window and pulled back the curtain. The third circle was there. It was just at the edge of the porch, not 20 feet from the cabin walls. The proximity was a physical blow. I could see the prints clearly now, long, slender feet with unnaturally long toes. They were pressed deep into the snow, each one perfect and distinct. It had been right there, just outside our door while I slept. The thought made me sick. "It's almost here," Sarah cried, her composure finally breaking. "Ben, what is it? What does it want?" I had no answers. I only had a growing primal certainty that it wanted in. We were no longer just scared, we were hunted. The cabin, our shelter, now felt like a trap. We were livestock in a pen, and the butcher was making his slow, deliberate rounds. We spent Tuesday huddled together in the center of the living room, as far away from the windows as possible. We spoke in whispers, as if it could hear us. Leo drew pictures in his notebook, a small, boxy cabin surrounded by spiraling lines of black footprints. The waiting was the worst part. We knew it would come back that night. We knew it would be closer. The only question was what would happen when it finally reached the cabin itself. That night, none of us even tried to sleep. We barricaded the door with a heavy sofa and armed ourselves with whatever we could find: kitchen knives, the fireplace poker, a heavy lamp. We turned off all the lights and sat in the oppressive darkness, listening. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. The silence was absolute, broken only by our own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. Then at 3:15 a.m., we heard it. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something being dragged slowly across the wooden porch. It was a dry, deliberate sound, the sound of something with no regard for stealth. It was the sound of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. We held our breath, frozen in terror. The scraping stopped directly in front of the door. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the noise. We stared at the barricaded door, our knuckles white on our makeshift weapons. Then came a new sound, a soft, wet, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the door. It wasn't a knock. It was a gentle, persistent bumping, as if a large, soft object was being repeatedly nudged against the wood. Leo started to cry, a high, thin whimper. Sarah clapped a hand over his mouth, her own eyes wide with horror. The thumping stopped. For a long, drawn-out minute, there was only silence. We began to hope, to pray, that it had given up, that it had gone away. Then a voice spoke, its sound muffled by the thick wooden door. It was a low, guttural, wet-sounding voice, a voice that sounded like it was struggling to form words it hadn't used in a very long time. "So cold," it rasped. "Let me in." The sound of that voice shattered our last hope that this was human. It was ancient, wrong, a sound that belonged to the deep, dark places of the earth. "Go away," I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. There was a pause. Then the thumping started again, but this time it was harder, more insistent. Thump. 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 The whole door shuddered with each impact. It was no longer asking. Then came the scratching, a sharp splintering sound as if long nails or claws were being dragged down the outside of the door, searching for a purchase, for a way in. We were going to die. I knew it with a chilling certainty. It was going to get in, and it was going to kill us. I looked at Sarah, at Leo, and a desperate, primal rage surged through me. I would not let it have them. "The back window," I hissed. "Go!" While the thing at the front door was preoccupied, we scrambled to the small window in the back bedroom. It was high, but it was our only chance. I smashed the glass with the poker, not caring about the noise. I lifted Leo up and pushed him through the opening, telling him to run and hide in the woodshed. Sarah followed. As I was climbing out, I heard a tremendous crash from the living room. The front door had given way. I didn't look back. I fell into the deep snow outside and ran, following Sarah towards the small, dark shape of the woodshed. We tumbled inside, pulling the door shut, and peered through a crack in the wood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the broken front door of the cabin. It was tall and emaciated, its skin a pale, almost translucent white. It was completely naked, its long limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. It had no hair, no eyes, no features to speak of, just a smooth, blank expanse of skin where a face should be. It turned its head slowly as if sniffing the air. It knew we were out here. It took a step off the porch, its bare feet sinking into the deep snow. Then another. It began to walk, not towards us, but in a circle around the cabin. The fourth circle, the final one. It moved with a terrifying, unhurried purpose. We were trapped in the woodshed, and it was now walking the perimeter of its new, smaller cage. We stayed hidden, shivering from cold and fear for what felt like an eternity. It circled the cabin twice, its blank face scanning the darkness. Then it stopped. It turned and looked directly at the woodshed. It had found us. It began to walk towards us, its long, pale form a horrifying apparition against the white snow. This was it. This was the end. I grabbed a rusty axe from the wall of the shed, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. And then a new sound cut through the night. A low, rumbling roar that grew steadily louder. A pair of bright lights appeared at the end of the long driveway, cutting through the darkness. A snowplow. The road was being cleared. The creature stopped. It tilted its featureless head, as if confused by the sound and the light. It looked from the approaching plow back to us. A silent internal calculation taking place. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed to hesitate. Then, with a speed that was utterly inhuman, it turned and sprinted back into the deep woods, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been. The plow driver, a man named George, found us half frozen and hysterical. He told us the storm had been the worst in decades, that he was just now able to clear a path. We told him a wild, rambling story about a bear, a story he clearly didn't believe but was kind enough not to question. The state troopers who investigated found the cabin in disarray, the front door smashed. They found our footprints leading to the woodshed, but they found no other tracks. The fresh snowfall that had started just after the plow arrived had covered everything, erasing all evidence of our visitor and its impossible spiraling trail. The official report concluded that we had suffered from cabin fever, that I had likely smashed the door in a fit of paranoia, and that we had imagined the rest. We sold the cabin without ever setting foot in it again. We moved to a crowded suburb, a place where you can always hear the sound of cars and neighbors, a place where the silence can never get too deep. The doctors say Leo's night terrors and my own crippling insomnia are symptoms of PTSD. They have given our fear a clinical, manageable name, but they weren't there. They didn't see the perfect bare footprints in the snow. They didn't hear that wet, rasping voice beg to be let in from the cold. And they didn't see that pale, faceless thing as it took its first step off the porch. I was there, and I know that some things are ancient and patient, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world is a trail that leads nowhere and everywhere, a trail that walks in circles, getting closer and closer until it finally reaches your door.